All right. Hello, everybody. This is Ian with Writing Launch, and welcome to today's presentation. I'm glad that so many of you have been able to show up to the live recording of this. It's always great to see people that can make it. Now, of course, we'll be recording this so you can watch it later, but it just is nice to have that interaction, and I'm so glad so many of you could show up. So today we're going to be talking about blog writing. I often get asked, what the easiest way to start a freelance writing career is, and almost always I say blog writing, and that is writing for existing blogs on the internet. It's incredibly straightforward. It's really easy to do even if you don't have any experience or if you just think you're not good enough. This is a really easy way to get started, and it's how I got started, how I built my career. It's proved to be really lucrative, which surprised me at first, honestly, because I didn't think that it would turn into anything this monumental, but it has. And so today what I'm going to be showing you over the course of the next hour is exactly what I did to build a blog writing career online, to give you the ins and outs of that, and just show you how to do it from start to finish. So yeah, over the next hour, that's what we'll be doing. If you have questions, please ask them in the comments below. We will be doing a Q&A session at the end. So yeah, any questions, please ask. We want this to be a great opportunity for you. And without further ado, let's start the webinar. So like I said, today is going to be all about blog writing, and this is actually going to be a free preview of our course called Breaking the Blog Writing. So the first thing I want to talk about is why choose blog writing. And there are a few reasons why I think that this is such a good option. And before I start, I just want to clarify, and I'll be talking about this a little bit more in just a moment, but we will be talking about becoming a regular blog writer for an already existing blog. A lot of people, when they hear the term blog writing, conflate it with blogging, which is having your own blog and publishing on that. And that's not what we're going to be talking about today. And I truly believe that it's usually wise if you don't start your own blog. And I'll talk about that just in a moment, but just to clarify. So why blog writing? Like I said, it's very lucrative. It's an incredibly flexible opportunity, and there's a lot of room for growth. There are so many great blogs out there who will pay you well and who need content. This is sort of a gold mine for freelance writers if you learn to navigate the ecosystem well, because there are new blogs that come out every day, but there are also a lot of really old established blogs that will pay you very well, and there's just so much to choose from. So you're not limited as you might be on, say, a content mill. And for many writers, it's a fun job. You can often choose you can choose your niche, and often you can choose which topics you write about. You can always choose which blogs you write for. It's not like working for a client where you're sort of under their heel. You get to have a little bit more freedom, and that's really liberating and really fun. So if you've been struggling with just having that passion in your writing life, this may be what you need. So those are just a few reasons. I think the most important for me, and also, like I said, it pays very well. I know a lot of you are stuck in lower paying jobs, doing things like content mill work or client work that just doesn't really pay that well. So this will be a nice change of pace if you're used to those low rates. And briefly, I just want to go over why you shouldn't start your own blog, because every time that I talk about blog writing, I get people asking, what if I want to start my own blog? And so I just wanted to go over why I think it's not a great idea for freelance writers to do so. Getting a brand new blog off the ground with no audience can take years, and I'm not exaggerating. Blogging and maintaining a blog requires a ton of monetary investment, a ton of marketing experience, sales, advertising. It's much more than just writing, and usually writing is only a little part of what doing a blog is all about. And if you want to just blog on the side, the thing is that's not really profitable, or it won't return an investment for you. So and if you want to do something more serious, it will take years. And just maintaining the blog is going to eat up your time, like I said, with all this this marketing, advertising, social media that you have to do. It's very time consuming, and that's why most all blogs have huge teams behind them doing all the work. And what I found, and this is especially true in my own life, is that freelancers generally don't have enough time to start and maintain a blog while they're freelancing. And that's because, obviously freelancing is your job, right? So it doesn't really make sense to try to take on this whole other animal while you're freelancing. And you might even find yourself spending hundreds or even thousands of dollars on blog related purchases. It is very easy to spend even tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years on something like ads or tools that your resources just to get your blog off the ground. And for that reason, that's one of the biggest, I think, roadblocks. And that, and just the time aspect, it's crazy. And you can, if you're interested, you can definitely look up the stories of how some blogs got started, but it's so difficult anymore. So that's usually why I don't recommend it. And like I mentioned, blogging on the side just isn't beneficial. A lot of people want to use a blog as a portfolio, and there are many other better options for that. And then if you just blog on the side, it's just not going to draw attention to your writing because no one will be able to find it, and it doesn't really give you that much credence because you're just self-publishing. And it really helps, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, is that if you're published on another site that you don't own, that's going to show others that other people and other publications are interested in your writing, and that's going to give you a large amount of social credit that will be invaluable to your writing career. So with all that in mind, let's talk about how to become a blog writer. So first, starting out. The first question that you have to ask yourself is simply, is blog writing for me? Because I will admit it's not going to be for every single one of you. I think it's a great opportunity for a large amount of freelance writers, but it's definitely something that you have to think about before you jump in. So some of the things you'll have to do are write consistently under deadlines, which can be a little bit of a pressure cooker at first, but it does, in my experience, and at least improve your writing skills. But there is that to grapple with if you're not used to it. You have to thoroughly research your topics, often finding a lot of expert resources to cite. You may have to do additional work, so you may have to, for example, find media or do some SEO, maybe just like keyword work, stuff like that. It requires a lot of self-motivation and a good amount of time and task management, and that time and task management is a big one, because even if you're just writing one article, you may be juggling several tasks and you're under a deadline. So if you're not used to that, it does take a little bit of adjustment and a little bit of self-discipline. By no means is it unmanageable. It's just a little strange to get used to. And this is a big one that I wanted to outline because this has been very true in my experience almost every time that I've written for a blog, and that is that you may be assigned topics to write on and given light instructions, so you have to fill in the blanks. Oftentimes I will just get a title of an article and I'll have to write the whole thing just based on that, no other information. So if you're not really good with that, that will take a little getting used to. But like I said, with deadlines, I think it does improve your writing as a whole. So I don't think any of these things are things to be afraid of, but they are just sort of disclaimers that I wanted to share because it's going to be a little bit of work if you're not used to it, but I do think it really pays off. So what I want to do for you is send you a bonus to help you really decide if blog writing is for you. And the bonus is simply called Is Blog Writing for You? And this is actually day one of our course, Break Into Blog Writing. And it's going to be yours completely free. And this way you can get not only a taste of the course, but also you can determine if blog writing is something that you want to do or not. So that should be landing in your email tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. And I think you will get a lot of use out of it. All right, now assuming you have decided that blog writing is for you and you're still interested, then what I'm going to express now is a simple two-step process that will help you get published as a blog writer in no time. The first step is to simply find blogs in your niche, and the second step is to pitch article ideas to those blogs. Now I'm going to unpack those ideas, those steps throughout this webinar, but I just wanted to give you this overview so you could see how simple it really is. There's not a lot of complicated rigmarole to go through. It's pretty straightforward. You just find a blog and you pitch to that blog and you rinse and repeat. And I think that's another reason why it's so appealing, is that it's so straightforward and it doesn't require a ton of effort to do, or a ton of time. It can be done really quickly. You can repeat this process very rapidly, and the return on your investment is just going to be so great. So let's talk about step one, how to find blogs. What I recommend doing is looking for what I'll be calling medium level blogs. And these are blogs that, maybe have a readership of anywhere from, let's say, maybe 10,000 to like a few 100,000 readers maybe. But more importantly, they're blogs that are situated in a very specific place in terms of how they pay writers. And what I've come to realize is that small blogs that don't really have a lot of readers or have a lot of funds, they often can't afford to pay writers just because they're small blogs and they don't have the budget. Now, you may think that you want to shoot for the top of the line blogs, but interestingly, a lot of those also don't pay because they provide exposure. And this is the problem you get with sites like the Huffington Post, where sure, you can get a byline on there and it looks impressive, but you're not going to get paid, and you certainly can't build a career on it. And quite honestly, that byline is not going to do much. So the solution is to look for medium level blogs that are somewhere in between the really small and the really big ones. I think because these medium level blogs are going to be the ones that pay the best. So you might be wondering how to spot medium level blogs. A few things I would look out for are a lot of bylined authors. And what this will show is that the publication, the blog, usually has, is accepting articles from a bunch of writers. And if they're employing freelance writers or have a rotating door of writers, this means that they generally accept freelance submissions. And we'll get to more on a minute about that, but that's one thing to look for. Also, lots of comments on each blog post is very helpful. If you just go around from article to article, you see a healthy comment section, that's always a good sign. It's not necessarily a warning sign if you don't see one, but it's just a good thing to keep an eye out for. Positive press is also a really good thing. So if this blog has been featured on other blogs or just linked to by other blogs, that's going to show that it's a very good blog with high credentials. These are all things that are just very ideal. By all means, I've gotten published on blogs that don't strictly meet these criteria, but most of them do. So that's what I would recommend just keeping an eye out for. And you also might want to try some Google search techniques. And actually, I find these to be helpful for more than just blog writing. They're good for a lot of things if you learn to use Google's advanced search techniques really well. So the one I'll be talking about today is very simple. So let's say your niche is writing. You want to write about writing. In this case, you would enter a query, something like this. So this whole thing would go into the Google search bar. You just type writing in quotation marks, a plus sign, and then guest post in quotation marks. And what this is going to do is this is going to make it so that Google will only give you results that have both of these exact phrases. So it's going to make sure that whatever pages are pulled up, they're going to have the words writing and then guest post. And this is just a really easy way to narrow down your search. And you can also do queries like writing and writer's guidelines or submission guidelines, write for us. These are all signs that a blog is accepting writers. And we'll talk about the writer's guidelines page in just a second. But this is usually a good sign that if you can find a good writer's guidelines page, you'll be all set. And of course, if your niche is in writing, you can just replace it with whatever. And like I said, these all go into the search bar as is with the quotation marks and the plus sign. So that's just kind of a shortcut, if you will. But I recommend using both techniques. And actually, what I'd recommend is maybe going through this step first and then going back to the last slide and making sure that the blogs meet the criteria. And some other key components to go over really quickly. Like I said, the writer's guidelines page is extremely important. Now, if you're not familiar with this, this page, also known as the submission guidelines or the Write for Us page, is basically the page that tells you as the freelance writer what the publication wants. So let's say you come across a blog, you go to the bottom of the site, they have a writer's guidelines page, you look at it. By reading that, you will learn exactly what the blog wants from you. So they'll give article guidelines, word counts, whether you need to find images or not. It'll usually be very comprehensive, and this is the single most important page or even document that you could read while blog writing. And what you need to do is you need to learn to read these thoroughly and carefully, because they will tell you everything that you need to know. They tell you exactly what the publication is looking for, and you will probably get your pitch rejected if you don't read the guidelines. Most of these guidelines that I've come across are super specific. They're super involved, and so if you don't follow those, you're not going to be meeting what the blog is looking for. So that's a big thing. Familiarize yourself with these pages, learn to find them, learn to read them really well. Cross your I's and dot your cross your T's and dot your I's with this. Look over it really carefully, because I just can't state this enough. Most often when writers don't get their pitches accepted, it's because they didn't read the guidelines. So that's just a little another little disclaimer for you. And also, the guidelines will tell you more often than not if a publication pays. And they will not only tell you that, but also how much the blog pays and how they pay. So for instance, I once got paid by check, and I've never gotten paid by check before, but I knew what I was getting into because that was stipulated in the guidelines. So like I said, this is just such an important part of the process. If you don't read this, you'll probably not get your pitch accepted. So something to keep in mind, at the forefront of your mind during this webinar and while you're doing this process. And on the topic of payment, I want to talk about that because it's a crucial aspect of this whole endeavor, because you don't want to work for peanuts, right? And I know a lot of you are used to these low rates, getting paid maybe a penny per word, or getting paid a few bucks an hour, whatever the case may be. So what you need to do is, and this can apply to more than just blog writing, but we're going to be talking about this in this context. You need to calculate how much work is involved. So for instance, do you have to find other media? Do you have to do SEO, to conduct a lot of research, complete other tasks? This is all stuff that's going to take up your time and your energy. And so you have to determine how much that's all worth to you. And you need to figure these tasks into the pay. And obviously, more involved articles should pay more. So if you come across a writer's guidelines page, and they say we'll pay you $20 for a 1,000-word article, and you have to find 5 images, you might want to rethink about that, because that's really not the best return on your investment of the time and the energy that you're putting into it. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, on the topic of finding blogs, I wanted to make it as easy as possible for you to find great blogs. So what I'm going to be sending you is another bonus, that is the paid publishing guidebook. And then this is going to be yours completely free, and it gives you access to hundreds of blogs that pay per post. In total, there are about 650 publications in this guidebook. Now, not all of those are blogs, but hundreds of them are. So this is, for all intents and purposes, a comprehensive resource that will help you get started with blog writing. And I always say that this is the resource I wish that I had had when I started out, because then I wouldn't have had to, scrape the internet looking in every nook and cranny for a blog that would pay well. And in the guidebook, we give you everything you need to know, from the name of the publication to how much they pay to a direct link to the writer's guidelines page. So it's a great resource. Yours completely free. We'll be sending that to you over the weekend, and I hope that you'll enjoy it, and I hope that it will make finding blogs that much easier for you. So definitely look out for that and use this to its fullest. Now that we've talked about how to find blogs, I want to talk about how to pitch blogs, because this is that second step. The first was to find blogs in your niche. The second was to pitch those blogs. Now, the topic of pitching is extremely involved, but today I want to just go over it in the context of pitching blogs specifically. There's a little bit of background work that I would really recommend doing. So first, you ideally should be a reader of the blog. Now, I know this isn't always the case, and certainly it hasn't been the case 100% of the time for me, but you should definitely at least read 5 to 10 articles from the blog to get a good idea of what they publish about. This is very crucial. And you want to analyze these articles for content and style. So you shouldn't just be reading them, just to read them. You should be reading them to gather information for your own use. So for instance, let's talk about the analyzing them for content. You might ask questions just as simple as what is this article about? Or how specific does this article get? And as far as style goes, you might ask yourself, what kind of writing voice is at work here? Or maybe how are the articles structured? This is all going to be really important because this will clue you in even more to what the publication wants. So even if you read the Writer's Guidelines page on this blog that you're now going to consider pitching, even if you've done that, it still helps to see examples like these ones firsthand that have been successfully published. So that's something I definitely recommend spending a good bit of time doing. And like I said, 5 to 10 articles is best. If possible, read more. The idea here is just to get as thorough an idea as possible of the type of content that the blog publishes. And in my opinion, you really can't have enough information when it comes to that. So take all the time you need here. And like I said, it will give you a solid knowledge of what topics the blog publishes, and it will also tell you what they want in articles, and also it will tell you who the audience is. We all know that keeping your audience in mind is crucial for any piece of writing, and that's very true here as well. So by reading this, by reading the articles that have already been published, you not only get an idea of what the blog is looking for, but the audience that they're catering to. So this is another important step that is definitely should not be overlooked. Once you've done that, brainstorm anywhere from 5 to 15 article ideas. That's just a rough number. The idea is this: you want to get a line of thought going that gets you more in tune with what the blog is looking for. And as part of that, you want to ask yourself, could you realistically see the blog publishing these articles? And this is where you have to be, as brutally honest with yourself as possible. You may find that an idea you had really isn't that good, even though you were attached to it. Or you might find that you have a lot of good ideas and you just are having trouble picking between them, which is a good problem to have. But you want to ask yourself, could you see that blog publishing these articles? And often that will help you pare down your list. And something that I recommend doing is comparing your pitches, your ideas, to existing articles on the blog. So by what I mean by that is, are they similar yet different? And to illustrate that, I'll give an example. Let's take Freedom with Writing, which is a wonderful resource that I'm sure you all know about. And if for some reason you don't, definitely check it out. So they publish a lot of articles about publications that pay writers. And I pulled this article. This is an article that's on the Freedom with Writing site. It's called 7 Magazines That Pay Writers $150 or More per Article. So already just in the title, this gives you a really good idea of the type of content that they publish. They publish information on how to get paid as a writer. So something that you might want to pitch to Freedom with Writing is 9 trade publications that pay $200 or more per article. So you can see how this follows the same formula, but the variables are different, right? So instead of magazines, you have trade publications. Instead of 150, you have 200. And even though it seems like technically it's a small difference, in reality, it's such a big difference because you have 2 different audiences at work here. You have 2 different pay levels, so it's similar yet it's different. And this is what you want to be looking out for when you have your own ideas. So out of those 5 to 15 article ideas, after you ask yourself if you could realistically see the blog publishing those articles, you want to compare them to the articles that are already existing on the blog and see if it just fits in with that world. And sometimes it just won't, and then sometimes all of your ideas would be bad and you have to hit the drawing board. That's completely fine. The goal here is just to get your ideas refined to a point where the blog's editor basically can't refuse it, because it's so close to what they want in an article. And something else you need to think about is what type of article would best satisfy the blog's readers. And this is another case where you want to keep the audience in mind. It's very important. And something that you might see even is blog readers maybe in the comments section or maybe on social media asking for or talking about specific topics and articles. So maybe you come across comments saying, I love this article, but I would love if you wrote about this. That's awesome, because that's basically a free pass for you. That's a free idea that a reader is asking about. And chances are, if a reader is asking about it, it's probably going to be a very good fit for that blog. So this is a little just tip. It's not going to work 100% of the time to see if the readers are talking about things. But in any case, you definitely want to think about the blog's audience and think about what kind of article they might want. So really, it's not even about your own ideas. It's about what the audience wants, because that's the ultimate goal of a blog, is to be there for the readers. So this is another element that I think gets overlooked a lot, but it really shouldn't be. So definitely keep this in mind when you're going through this process of coming up with article ideas. Once you've done all that, just settle on one idea to pitch, and often this can be difficult, but once you've done that, you just want to pitch like you would for a regular print publication, and I'll briefly go over that. You want to start with a short intro, just, I usually say how I found or how I came across the blog, or sometimes I'll just say I'd like to pitch an article to your blog or blog name, insert blog name here. And then you just pitch your story idea in 1 to 2 concise paragraphs. And by concise, I mean about 2 to 3 sentences each. When I talk about this, a lot of writers are surprised that the pitch is so short, but that's exactly what editors want to see, because editors don't really have a lot of time throughout the day to be looking at these, long pitches. And I've seen writers pitch, I've seen some pitches that have been, 3 to 4 huge paragraphs, and the whole thing is sort of like a short story. And that's kind of what you don't want, because that's, usually going to get just put in the trash or just overlooked because it's so long. So I recommend 1 to 2 concise paragraphs, 2 to 3 sentences each. And you want to end with a question. This is a little trick that I use because it creates a dialogue between you and the editor. So if you just end with something like, "Thank you for your time," it doesn't really have a sort of emotional pull to it. But if you say something like, "I could have this article ready done in a week. Does that work for you?" Then that compels the editor to respond. And in my experience, when I've done this, I usually get more responses when I end with a question than when I don't. So it's just a little trick for you to try out. By all means, you don't have to, but it's something that I found to be very successful. Now, after a week or two, after you've sent the pitch, follow up if you haven't gotten a response. And this is incredibly important. I've gotten a lot of articles published just because I followed up. And I actually just had a conversation with a member of our Writing Launch program who talked about the fact that she had to follow up a couple times before her article got accepted, and now it's on its way to newsstands. So the follow-up can really make a difference, and that's just because editorial teams are busy. Oftentimes your pitch idea may get accepted, and after you submit the article, they may just have forgotten about it. So after you pitch and after you've written the article, if you don't hear back after a week or two, definitely follow up. And like I said, a polite, well-timed follow-up can absolutely mean the difference between publication and rejection. That's just the reality of it. And so if you learn to follow up at the right time, like I said, a week or two, that can often cement you as a blog writer instead of just letting your article fall by the wayside. Now, to help you with this, because my goal with this webinar is really to just help you get started as comprehensively as possible, to leave no stone unturned. I know a lot of you may not be super familiar with pitching, so I'm going to be sending you a third and final bonus that is the road-tested pitch template. So this is basically the pitch template that I used to get published. What I did was I looked at all my successful pitches that I'd done over the years, and I condensed them. I found the similarities in all these, and I noticed there was sort of an underlying structure. So this is going to be that structure. I just took the what worked and I put it all in this resource. And so this is going to be something you can use, you can customize to make your own, and I highly recommend you do so. And I guarantee you will have a lot more success with with this than with these longer form pitches if you're used to that. But it's definitely something to check out, and we'll be sending that to you in your email, like I said, over the weekend. And like I said, if you have any questions, we will have a Q&A segment very shortly, so make sure you get those in if you want. And I should also say about pitching that if your pitches aren't successful right away, don't sweat it. It takes a long time to get good at pitching. It took me years to get good at pitching. I think maybe 2.5 years before I was really confident in my approach. So definitely don't be too hard on yourself if you just are getting a rejected pitch after a rejected pitch. And one more thing that I'll mention is that if you get negative feedback, that is awesome, because it's better to get negative feedback than it is to get no feedback. Because then you can learn, what you're doing, what you could be doing better, what you can improve on, and then you can refine your next pitches to be closer to what these editors are looking for. All right, so now we'll move into the Q&A segment. I want to just address as many questions as I can through the rest of this time limit. So let me cut the screen share real quick. Okay, there we go. All right, so like I said, if you have questions, please ask them. I'll get to as many as possible. And so let's start. We have a question from Andrea who asks, what's SEO? That's a good question. If you don't know about it, it's not something you have to worry about it. It stands for search engine optimization. And usually what that means as far as blog rating goes is that certain blogs may ask you to include keywords or certain phrases in the text. And that's something that you might want to be aware of and learn to implement in your writing. So it takes a little bit to get used to, but it's usually not a big deal. And not every blog will ask you to implement these keywords. But yeah, overall, don't worry about it just because it gets into a very large and complex process. We have a question from Mike who asks, are there any successful blogs that publish fiction similar to flash fiction submissions to magazines, etc.? Now, these are questions that I get a lot, and I think it's because a lot of writers sort of conflate the worlds of freelance writing and creative writing, and they're not the same. They're very different. So right off the bat, I would say no, just because the kind of blogs that I'm talking about in this webinar are strictly more informational, nonfiction type of things, and that's generally what we mean when we say freelance writing. Now that said, there are blogs that publish fiction that you can apply, that you can pitch to, but they're not what I would consider traditional blogs. So, for instance, if you know the site Forbes, I think Forbes is a good example of a traditional blog, even though they might not call themselves that. They're a site that publishes content, publishes articles regularly, so they fall under the definition of a blog. That's something that I would consider to be a traditional blog, or a site like Wired or something like that, or even The Atlantic is somewhat of a blog. So these are the types of places that we usually talk about when we say blogs. So to answer your question more specifically, there are, but I definitely want to make sure to sort of draw, delineate a line between freelance writing and creative writing. And not that there's anything wrong with creative writing, it's just sort of not, creative writing doesn't fall under the umbrella of freelance writing usually. Like you wouldn't say you're a freelance poet, for instance. So if anything, that's more of a terminology difference, but that's a good question and I'm glad that you asked. We have a question from Elizabeth who asks, can you ask them who their audience is? You can, but I think it depends on your approach. It really does. Because if you go up and ask without sort of any context, and if you say something like, I'm interested in getting published, who's your audience? That kind of makes it sound like you haven't done your due research. So that's the kind of a question I would sort of avoid. If you want to ask about maybe specific demographics or statistics, maybe like how many blog readers do you have? That could be a good question to ask. But usually you should be able to infer that from just looking at the blog, reading the articles. That should give you a good sense of the kind of audience that they're looking for. All right, we have a question from Chris who asks, is blog writing an international endeavor? Yes, it is. We get this question a lot, surprisingly. And freelance writing and blog writing, all that stuff is completely international. I've written for blogs based out of Australia, based out of England. It doesn't matter where in the world you are, and I think that's one of the great things about freelance writing in general, is that you don't need to be tied to a specific location to do the work. So that definitely applies to blogs. Now, of course, there are exceptions. For example, there might be blogs that want to publish only writers from, Alabama or something like that. But by and large, I mean, 98% of the time, it'll be completely international, so you don't need to worry about that. We have a very interesting question from Nina, who asked, how much is the right price for a 500-word blog article? Basically, I can't answer that question for you, just because every writer charges differently, and the topic of payment is so complex that I feel like if I were to just answer you, I wouldn't do the topic justice. What I would recommend is learning to calculate your own per project rate. And it usually helps if you can break it down to a per word rate. I don't recommend charging per hour, just because it's an antiquated way of charging that doesn't really, jive with most freelancers. For example, I don't log my time, or, I rarely am ever, sitting down for, a chunk of a few hours working at a time, because I'm always in and out. And some people are just like that schedule-wise. But getting back to the point, I would distill your rate down to a per word rate, and there are many good resources for this. And we talk about this in our No BS course on freelance writing, a little bit more about payment and the idea of how to structure it. But then figure out, how much, so you would take your per word rate, multiply that by 500 in this case, and see how much that comes out to be. I think, as a minimum, I would recommend charging no less than 8 cents per word. And that's like bottom of the barrel if you have no experience at all. I get paid anywhere from, 15 to 20 cents per word usually. And I think that, the more experience you have, obviously, the more you should charge to ensure that your rate is commensurate with your experience. So that's a really good question, and it is, just like I said, a very complex one, and ultimately a very personal one. You may be living in an area where the cost of living is not as high as maybe where I am, or maybe where someone else is. And so all of these different socioeconomic factors are going to play into it. But it's a really good question, and I think it's worth a lot of research and study. So if you're curious about payment, or if you're not sure if you're charging enough, if you want to get a bearing for that, do a little bit of research, see how other freelancers charge, maybe talk with other freelancers, ask them how much they charge, and of course, that helps you build community as well. So I hope that answered your question a little bit. Like I said, it is just a tough topic. Let's see. This is a very good question. Katie asks, when pitching, is it a good idea to sell your credentials or just get to the idea? And this is one question, but I want to focus on this one. Is it a good idea to sell your credentials or just get to the idea? A lot of writers, and especially people who are coming from creative writing, and I know a lot of you are, when they go over to freelance writing, or when one is new to freelance writing, shall I say, they often have this idea that, oh, I want to make sure that I, show the publication that I can do this work by telling them about my previous experience. When in reality, and I kind of mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar, but previous experience doesn't matter. You can have no experience and go through these exact steps I mentioned and have a really successful blog writing career. Or on the flip side, you can have years of experience and that almost doesn't matter. Now, you can mention it, but I think it's better to just, as you said, get to the idea. And the reason is because blogs today are more selective than they ever have been before. And that might sound intimidating, but it's actually good news for you, because that can inform your approach to pitching, right? And what blogs are looking for, and I think this will be an important tidbit for you if you're looking to do this. Blogs are looking for content that is tailor-made for their blog. And for this reason, I don't recommend simultaneous submissions. So that's pitching the same idea to more than one blog. I don't recommend that because you will have a much higher percentage of a much higher chance of getting successfully published if you create custom pitch ideas for each blog that you visit. And that's just because blogs today want to specialize. They want to deliver a unique experience that you can't get anywhere else. And if you have an article that can be published on several different sites, that typically means that it's way too generalized and that it's a little too just broad in its appeal. And so when you're looking to actually pitch that, a blog might say, sorry, that's just not specific enough to our audience. And that certainly happened to me before. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, is just creating that custom-made content for each blog. And that sounds like it's extra work, but it's really not. It takes really no more time than you would to come up with a more general article idea. And the reason, and I'll get to some other questions in just a moment, but I think this is just an important question to talk about, an important idea. And the reason why selling your credentials really doesn't work is that often editors just don't care. And I mean that in a very good way, a very positive way. Editors, above all, they're looking for good stories, good article ideas. And that's the meat and potatoes of what they're looking for when they open up a pitch from a random freelance writer that they've never heard of before. They're not going to, see that you're, a Harvard graduate and a writer for the New Yorker and, suddenly give you the job. So your article idea is going to take precedence over everything else. And once you realize that, that can actually be really helpful, because that, like I said, can inform your approach and really give you a concrete kind of sense of what you're dealing with. So yeah, that's a great question. And she also asked, thoughts on having a personal website in lieu of a blog. Are you able to put your articles on your own site that have been published on others, or does that violate copyright? That will be just a site-by-site issue. Copyright is sort of an odd thing when it comes to blog writing, and if you're curious about that, I highly recommend checking in with your editors. But having a personal website in lieu of a blog, I think that's fine. Many writers have websites, and it can be a good way to just host a portfolio. It's one of many good options to host a portfolio. You don't have to have a site or a blog. There are many sites, like Contently is what I use to host my portfolio. And if you're curious as to what that looks like, you can go to ianchandler.contently.com. That's contently.com. And see what that looks like. But our website is one of many good options, but like I said, you don't have to have one. So yeah, very good questions. We have a question from Joanne saying, I'm interested in the holistic industry. Is there a specific place to look for blogs wanting this content? The first thing that I would recommend is looking in your email this weekend for that paid publishing guidebook that I mentioned, because it's all categorized by niche. So you'll find, stuff about writing, business, parenting, lifestyle, all laid out for you really well. And I'm very sure that you'll be able to find just almost of any industry that you want to in there. So keep an eye out for that, definitely. Let me see. Okay, this is another good question that we actually got from a couple people. Asking if you don't have writing samples, if you can send self-published blog posts for examples. And I would say no. Now, this is another question that I get a lot, and I understand the intent behind this, but I talked earlier about social credit, and that idea is very, very relevant to this question. And the reason is, anyone can start a blog. I could go and start one in literally under 30 seconds, and I could have an article up today. I could have several articles up today. But what that means is that anyone can start a blog, right? So the implication there is that just because you're published on the internet doesn't mean that your writing is any good necessarily. And I don't mean that in an offensive way. I'm not talking directly to you, but the point is, if you're published somewhere else on a site that you don't own, on a blog or a publication or whatever, that shows other people that, hey, someone is interested in this person's writing, or this person's writing is so good that it got published. And so it adds so much social credit. And if you just link to your own blog, it's sort of a very straightforward manner of showing what your work can do. But when you're looking for jobs as a freelance writer, and this applies not only to blog writing but to getting clients as well, you're dealing with social credit. You want to show an editor or a client that your work is so good that it's been published elsewhere. So that's a big part of this whole process. And like I said, if you just send them your own blog and say, hey, this is my writing, it kind of gets the job done. But it's just not the best approach in my opinion. So I would definitely recommend just staying away from that if you can, and sticking only to published and bylined work that you've gotten on other sites. And the reason that the byline is so important is because if a work isn't credited to your name, you're going to have to prove you wrote it somehow. And it also kind of, and I was discussing this with another Writing Lunch member, and she expressed the idea that if she sent an article without a byline, but that she had written, it would make her come off as untrustworthy. And I think there's a lot to that, because anybody could pull up a random article and say, I wrote this, and the editor might go, well, there's no byline, how do I know? And so it's a little more complicated. Whereas if you have articles that are credited to your name on a site or a blog that you don't own, that is going to show that your writing is good enough that it got published, that other people are interested in it, and that's going to ultimately be a large part of why you might get a pitch accepted or not, or it's at least something that editors definitely consider. Now, again, like I said, it's not necessary. You can have no experience and pitch very successfully, but it does help. So consider that. Let me see. Here's a good question from Rachel, who asked, should we pitch more than one idea at a time per blog? I would say no, just because if one of your ideas doesn't make it, you can always just try again with another one. And like I said, a lot of this has to do with thinking about the editor and putting yourself in their shoes. These medium level blogs that I'm talking about, editors of those blogs are usually swamped with having imagine like inboxes full of unread emails, lots of phone calls they have to be making, lots of things they have to do around the office, and so consequently they don't have time to look at these really long pitches. And that's why I advised shorter pitches, is because they're more digestible for these super busy editors. So this question goes along with that. So if you pitch multiple ideas in one pitch, it's going to be more problematic for the editor to digest that, and they're going to have to kind of work through it. Whereas if you just pitch one idea, it's incredibly straightforward, and it's easier for them to pay attention, it's easier for them to remember, and you will increase the chances of getting a response for sure. So that's a great question. Got a question from Lisa saying, please repeat your host portfolio site. It's contently.com, and that is spelled CONTENTLY.com. And you can look at mine by going to ianchandler.contently.com. And I highly recommend you do so if you want to kind of just have a look at what a finished portfolio might look like. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting question from Mike, who asks, can freelance blogging lead to job opportunities such as being an editor, or is that an entirely different career path? That is a very interesting question. I would say it depends. I think when we're talking about the editorial level, usually that means having some sort of connection, maybe in the literary world or in the article publishing, the blogging world. But I definitely think that there is a good trajectory that you can expect. So for instance, and this has happened a couple times to me, one of two things will usually happen. I will write an article for a blog and they'll say, great, and I'll just go around, I'll just turn around and pitch another one to them, and eventually become a regular writer. Now, I won't have a title, but I'll just be a regular contributor to that blog, and that's one of the ways in which I think blog writing can be very lucrative, because that's happened several times to me and to other writers that I've talked to. So that's definitely, that's kind of the first kind of career path you can expect, just become a regular contributor. And then you could kind of level up from there and become a staff writer, where you actually get like a title and you're technically a part of the blog's team, which has also happened to me a couple of times. And I know that's the case for a lot of writers out there who are writing for blogs, is they have these sort of more tenured titles. Now, I'm sure that it's possible to become an editor, eventually going up to that. But I think it's more realistic to just expect to become, a regular writer. But I mean, that said, I think even being a regular writer for a blog has a lot of perks, a lot of advantages, a lot of it will create a lot of opportunities for you. And I think that's one of my favorite things about blog writing, is that there are just so many opportunities that it can give you. You can, become a staff writer. You can, build up a portfolio if you don't have one. You can. It's just so many doors open once you've gotten published. And I think this is just the easiest way in this day and age to get published. So let's go over maybe 3 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. We have a question from Beth who asked, how many hours a week do you devote to blogging? This will vary from person to person. Everyone's situation is different. You might, spend 3 hours of your day looking for blogs and pitching them and then writing, or you might spend 7 hours a day doing that. It's really up to you. And I think that's one of the good things about blog writing, is that it's so flexible. Let's go over maybe 2 more questions, because I think I think every question so far has been really good, and I just want to say thank you for sending in all of these, because like I said, it's my job to help you as much as possible, and I hope that I've done so. Here's a good question from Ben, who asks, you said it took a few years to get your pitch right. Were you still able to book gigs during that time? Yes, I was. And also, as a novice, because of my lack of experience, should I not expect booking gigs for at least a year? By booking gigs, I'm assuming you mean getting published in blogs, just because gigs can refer to any sort of freelance contract or freelance job. But assuming you mean that, I don't think a year is at all. I think you can do. I think you can get a job in a way shorter time period. I'm trying to think back to when I started. I think I probably got my first successful blog post published on another site maybe 2 months after I seriously started. And that's because, I was just sending out those long pitches. Whenever I go back and look at them, I'm just, so embarrassed, because they're just these little novels in an email. But I think if with this information that I've given you, especially the road tested pitch template, I think you should be able to cut that time down to even maybe a month. So you shouldn't need to wait too long to expect to get a response. Especially, like I said, with this information, because a lot of the mistakes that you make are ones that I've covered, about the pitches being too long, about the ideas not being specific enough. So have faith. You never know what you're going to run into. All right, a couple more questions. Let's see. Here are a couple short ones. We have a question from Chris, who asks, if your first pitch is rejected or ignored and you pitch a different idea, do you change your template? No, I would recommend just having usually the same one. If it's ignored, may be in that case just because you already have sort of a background with that editor, but I would recommend, at least at first, just trying the same template and seeing how that works for you, because it should work pretty well. But on that note, if your first pitch is rejected, I actually would recommend waiting a little bit before re-pitching to that same blog. Definitely pitch to other blogs, but maybe for that same blog, wait maybe 2 months or something like that, just because if they rejected or ignored your first idea. Actually, I'll refine that. I'll qualify that a little bit. If they ignore your first idea, wait a couple months. If they reject your first idea, maybe just a week or 2, because then at least there's some communication between you and the editor. Katie asked, can you go over the invoicing and getting paid process? I would, but this is just so up to each individual blog. I've gotten paid, usually by PayPal, sometimes by check. Sometimes I have to send an invoice, sometimes I don't. It just varies so wildly. And again, the writer's guidelines page is going to give you pretty much all the information you need. You may have to ask the editor of the blog about it, but it's just going to vary so much that I really can't answer that question. But if you look at the writer's guidelines page, you should be able to find that information. Like I said, if you don't, definitely ask an editor, because that's what they're there for. Let's see. Let's go through maybe 2 more. Oh, here's a question. Here's a good question. That's a follow-up from an earlier question. Jenny asked, so what do you do when the samples, what do you do when samples are asked for and you only have personal samples? In that case, I would provide no samples at all. If they're asked for specifically, then yes. But if they're not asked for, and that usually happens. Rarely have I ever had an editor, ask me for samples. And usually, if you go on the writer's guidelines page, I would say about 70% of the time they don't ask for previous samples of your work. And that's one of the reasons why blog writing is such an accessible career path, is because you don't need any experience for so much of it. You can just, even if you have no prior experience or prior publications right now, you can get started. But if they are asked for specifically, I would go ahead and provide them. But that's sort of a worst case scenario. Usually that just won't happen. If it does, go ahead. Don't worry too much about it. And let's see. We'll finish up with a question from Chip, who said, this webinar has been so comprehensive already, especially with this Q&A. What will your course cover that you haven't already? That's a good question, and that was actually sort of my goal with the webinar, is to provide you with so much information that you were wondering, well, what's the course going to be like? Because there's so much information here. Imagine this webinar, but just every topic explored in depth over the course of 4 weeks, and that is basically the Breaking the Blog Writing course. We go over everything from pitching more in depth to how to talk to editors, to how to analyze blog styles and how to adapt your style to match those styles. And so it focuses a lot on not only the process but also the craft. And like I said, it's 4 weeks long, which is I think a good amount of time to kind of memorize, get used to this process, because certainly, in this hour, I've been able to jam pack a lot of information for you, but it's the kind of thing that you need to think about every day if you want to take it seriously. And so I think that's where the course comes in and just provides, detailed information, just holds your hand through the whole process. So like I said, even if you haven't started, it'll be good for you. Okay. Since let's see, it's 3:57, and I just want to be here for about an hour, so we'll do one more question, and then I will call it a day. We have a question from Elizabeth, who asked, how do you generate article ideas? This is a very good question, and this is something that we talk about in the course, is how to, it's this idea of an idea machine, where you're in this state of, just kind of training yourself to constantly think of article ideas and to get them from all sorts of inspirational places. Maybe you're walking down the street and you think of something, or you see, or you read a book and you think of something, or something like that. Because a good article idea can come from anywhere. But more specifically, I think that what it comes down to is reading the blog. So let's say and like I said, you want to create custom pitches for each blog and custom article ideas for each blog. So let's just say, let's say you want to, publish on we'll call it blog X. So you read blog X, maybe 20 articles from this blog, and you get a good sense of what the kind of content that they publish. Your job as the writer who wants to write for this blog is to think of an idea that, like I said in the webinar, is similar yet different. So you want to take the hallmarks of their style and see how you can add to it. Think about what they haven't published about that would be a good fit, or maybe another topic that would go well within that world of their blog. And this is certainly a trickier thing, because it's not something that's super concrete. When we're talking about just ideas and thinking of new article concepts. But like I said, I think just reading the blog, it will usually give you a really intuitive sense of what article ideas would be good for that blog. So with that said, it's been about an hour, and I don't want to keep you any longer. But I do want to just once again thank you for being here, for watching the webinar. I also want to just thank you for sending in so many good questions. They were wonderful. I always love having the Q&A segments because I like being able to address your questions and your concerns personally, in real time. So that's wonderful. If you have any questions about either the courses or the webinar or anything, please feel free to email me at support@writinglaunch.com. Either Jacob or I will answer. No matter what question you have, whether it's about blog writing or whether about pitching or anything, we are more than happy to help. So with that said, we'll call it a day. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. I would love your comments. Any ways you think that I can improve it or just things you like, please go ahead and forward those to my email. And I hope you have a wonderful day.